Welcome to today's asset servicing webinar that we're hosting in partnership with our good friends at Broadridge. My name is Martin Lawrence. I will be moderating today's webinar, where we're really going to look to examine how the asset servicing landscape is evolving amid rising volumes, increasing data-driven errors, and in some areas, slowing automation. We'll try to explore where firms are struggling and where the industry is responding to those struggles. We'll also look at some of the practical steps and technologies that organizations can and should prioritize in 2026 as they look to build scale, reduce risk, and perhaps most importantly, improve client outcomes. To do that, I'm delighted to be joined by a really great panel with more years in asset servicing experience than I'm sure we'd all really like to admit. But we have Demi Derem from Broadridge, Larry Bajek from Broadridge, as well as Matt Moseley from Goldman Sachs and Richard Nichols. Gents, if I could get you all to do a very brief introduction. Maybe we'll start with you, Demi.
Sure. So very quickly, I'm the P&L owner of Broadridge's international corporate governance business. So everything in between issuer and investor is really my ecosystem of interest. I'm part of the Broadridge ILT. I also sit on I'm a board member of the ICJ, which is a JV between Broadridge and the JPX. And I'm also ISA operating committee member. So thank you, everyone. I will hand over to someone else.
Larry, why don't you go next?
Sure. I'm Larry Bajek from Broadridge. So I have work across our asset servicing globally, and we really focus on scale, resiliency, and how we can help firms navigate their operation model through the evolving marketplace. Happy to be here. I think what makes this survey pretty cool is that we're not talking about a future problem, right? We're talking about problems that we all see and feel now with the increased volumes, right? Cost pressures and just the increasing operational risk. So it's good to have some data behind what we all know is inherently there.
Thanks, Larry. And
yeah, well, thanks, Martin. Great to be here. So I'm Matt Moseley. I run asset servicing at Goldman Sachs. Been in the industry for almost 20 years now. The majority of that has been in or around asset servicing. So at the moment, very focused on all things asset servicing.
Thanks, Matt. And lastly, but of course, name is leastly, Richard.
Hi, wonderful to be here. And similar to Matt, I've got 20 years plus these days in asset services, both around the client service side, but mainly concentrating on voluntary.
Thank you. And we won't ask how big the plus is on that 20 years. So the webinar that we're going to go through today, it's part of an ongoing campaign we've been working on with Broadridge this year, where the campaign has been called Broadening Asset Servicing. For those of you, hopefully you've all seen it, the key findings, the white paper. If you haven't, we're going to post the link to it here shortly in the chat function. And what I wanted to do before we get into the discussion was just use a few of the slides from the key findings just to kind of talk about some of the challenges that came up. But the first thing that came through in the survey was just that volumes are up. Volumes are up. You can see it on screen here. On average, we're looking at an increase in volume of around 25%, depending on what type of firm you are. Investors being the hardest hit. And actually, if you look at it on a regional perspective, Asia, it really is the hardest hit area for volume increases. But that only really tells part of the story for me, because the second part of the story is all about complexity, which is really increasing as well as firms invest in ever different types of assets, private markets, and as kind of the capital markets, the departments look for ever new ways to be more creative in their corporate action offering documents. And we're doing all that where our budget to support asset servicing it's not declining, but it's growing at its slowest ever rate. And I think there's a couple of ways we can kind of unpack this. One is that, look, 2023, we clearly increased our corporate action budgets substantially. So maybe we all did really good jobs and we have brought in lots of new technology and automated. And so we're now reaping the benefits of that. Maybe that's just because we've got a lot of scale already in our existing systems. Or maybe we are just, suffering with not being able to secure more budgets. But one thing that is clear is that where people do have more budget, it's generally being spent more on headcount than anywhere else, which I think is a really interesting story. We are seeing a number of firms who are reducing their budgets for asset servicing across IT and systems. But when it comes to headcount, everyone's increasing. Why is that? Well, we know headcount always increases every year in cost. But also, I think there's a bit of a story there still around, a lack of maybe trust in some of the data we're receiving, a need to put manual controls around that. And then, a question we'll probably unpack a little bit shortly will be, what's the tipping point there? How much more scale do we really have in this scenario? And also we're seeing kind of automation rates drop. So for brokers most extensively, this is an area that we've discussed quite extensively with firms around why are automation levels reducing. And I think the question we all need to ask ourselves here is, what does good look like? Does good look like being 100% automated? Probably not. Does it look like being 80% automated? I don't know. That's the question again that we'll try and dive into maybe a little bit as we go through. And then just the last bit on here for me for this point is really just around data. We know that errors are a big problem in corporate actions. We know volumes are up. We know that the position sizes are up. And so errors are very costly. And it's data that sits at the forefront of all of those errors, either from data at source or some form of upstream or downstream data. I do also now just want to quickly, Sunny, if you can, put up the first poll question, just so I can get a little bit of a view from the people here today around where they're seeing their biggest challenges, whether or not it's through rising event volumes, event complexity, data quality. Could it be that your legacy systems aren't quite up to date and are challenging to change? Or do you have an internal capacity problem? So kind of goes aligned with what we said before, with data quality probably being the biggest problem. Richard, if it's okay, I'm going to come to you with the first question, which is we're going to be discussing kind of volumes and why volumes are rising faster than automation. But from your perspective, we saw there brokers are reporting the steepest kind of automation drops at higher error costs. For you, from your perspective, what's really driving the widening gap between volume and growth and automation and operations?
It's a complex question to start with, but I'll give you my perspective. I think there's several factors that could be at play, and the first is capacity. So many teams in asset services are lean in terms of their headcount and are obviously more sensitive to any volume spikes that come along. And this may well impede their ability to plan or to implement their strategy. When teams are in the weeds, they're dealing with increased risk in the here and now. There is always a tendency to revert to tried and tested procedure. Teams have less time to map processes or to design citizen-led solutions or even raise issues to their technology partners. I think the second one is with operational errors, the attention often is on the control framework, and the natural reaction to that is to place more human control around a process or a procedure. And the immediate solution, and that immediate solution, will rapidly remediate the problem. And often there's always a demand to solve these problems as soon as possible. But does that necessarily solve the long term? Maybe not. There may also be a confidence factor here, because if you're employing more automated solutions, particularly in response to operational issues, they need to be thoroughly robust in order to fully remediate the risk. There's another angle I thought about here, and that's that it might also be the case that citizen-led automation opportunities have plateaued. We know that there are certain technologies that have been out there for some years now, and firms are inevitably using them. And that might mean that the meat on the bone is very much core build. Now, when we talk about core build, that relies on greater investment in terms of human capital, in terms of time, in terms of money. And even if you've got that solution, you've got the age-old conflict of a budgetary priorities issue, where you're facing regulatory or business-led demands, then automated solutions may well take a back seat.
Yeah, 100%. Certainly know that asset servicing budgets often go down the priority order compared to some of the other areas with it that firms are dealing with. And, there's a lot of change happening in the market at the moment. And interesting, the one you mentioned there around having more control, and human nature is, when we have a risk area, to add more and more controls, but it's hard to step back once you've bedded in those controls at times, and we end up with these processes that we're just layering on top of all the time. Matt, maybe from your side, again, look, we saw voluntary event volumes rising up to 50% in some regions. From a Goldman's view, what are the structural pinch points preventing you from automating further?
Yeah, look, I think maybe it's a bit of an opening statement on this. I think actually as an industry, we've probably automated more than we give ourselves credit for. Like when you look at the core high volume standardized events, like there's no doubt that firms are far more automated than they were 5 to 10 years ago. And that I think certainly comes through when you look at some of the detail in the survey, which is a great story for industry, good story for end investors. I think the problem is less at the core. It's more what remains. And as we know within asset servicing, like there is a very long tail of edge cases. So we've got the nuance, local market practices, bespoke restructurings, optionality, the things and challenges that I think we're all very familiar with. Traditional, more deterministic automation, which I think has been our go-to tool historically, has done really well at the top of the curve. But as you start to get into the long tail, we really start to struggle. And to some extent, that I think really becomes an economic question, in that every extra use case that we automate, right, the marginal return starts to diminish. The cost probably goes up to implement that because it's exponentially more complex. And look, I think the structural points on that are very familiar. They haven't changed for a number of years. I think a lot of markets across Europe operate slightly differently. The data is imperfect. There are a wide variety of clients that we cover. They all have a different expectation, different need, different controls. One thing I would say, and that I'm sure we'll get into this later on in the conversation, is that I am personally quite optimistic, though, about the forward when we think about some of those structural challenges. So if you think about like the economics of automation, that is definitely changing. It is no doubt getting less expensive to automate. So those cases down the tail, which now are in scope or have positive ROI, that is improving. The toolkit that I think we all have, that is night and day in comparison to what we even had, I think, a year ago. So like it was unimaginable that we may have had tools that could reason, that could start to validate items where you are in this environment of uncertainty, right, with things like AI. So like that, I think is going to be a massive unlock for us, particularly in business like asset servicing. And then finally, and again, I'm sure we'll talk about this, but there is massive opportunity, I think, with things like T+1 to start to drive standardization. So when you go back, I think, to some of those structural points, like I can see that there is a path forward that would ultimately result in us getting more done on the tail.
Good. The optimist view. I like the optimist view. Too often, asset servicing conversations end up talking about horror stories. So
right,
good to have that optimistic lens on it. Demi, I guess from your perspective, again, just with the preface that we've had, the survey campaign came back to say that a number of firms are cutting system spend and adding headcount. As a technology provider, and with the kind of cross-client view that you have, why do you think automation is failing to keep pace despite increased workflow, tooling options, or do you think maybe there's a bit of a midsummer in there?
Yeah, I mean, it's in terms of what we just highlighted, it's sort of counterintuitive in terms of rising volumes with the inset of new technologies, particularly AI, as Matt highlighted. but still the need to have more manual processes. So I think and again, personas are really important depending on what angle you come at this at. And I think most firms are on a journey, probably triggered by T+1, in order to really speed up what they do. And therefore, what they haven't been able to in a very short space of time is totally re-platform their technology so it's all real time, and the efficiencies that will then go through the whole of the ecosystem and workflow would benefit. So I think what we've seen over the last few years, at least, is a number of sort of iterations of improvements in different pockets of internal workflows, rather than a whole ecosystem rewrite, which would have generated more of an automation. And need to mention data. I mean, everything stems from where the data comes from and the liability around it. And the whole scrubbing process continues to exist at scale, but now needs to happen a lot quicker and then go out the door. So I could see how there's a bell curve where people are sort of plugging the gaps as the technology sort of picks up and sort of covers, catches up. But I think that might explain why we've got this oddity of, volumes are rising, more people have been introduced, less spend on technology. So somewhere between the three of what I've just mentioned and between all of us is the truth. But I think that may explain some of the odd observations we've seen in the survey.
Yeah, thanks, Demi. And Larry, I guess from your opinion, and again from the clients you're speaking with, do you have any kind of other views on that, on why we might be seeing kind of that reduced levels of automation?
I do. So I think I just build upon what Demi said about kind of looking at a new platform versus what I say is people just taking Band-Aid approaches. I think it was pretty interesting that in the survey, the second one that we saw was legacy systems. So to me, it's not that automation failed, it's that it's really being outpaced by structural change. The industry itself is more complex now, right? We have cross-border investing, regulation. The events themselves have become more complex. I mean, to me, it feels like people are just dreaming up ways to make these things more difficult when they're coming up with these offerings. But people are dealing with frameworks that were put in place years ago, right? So they have multiple systems, they're dispersed systems, they look differently, they're not integrated, data isn't moving around fast enough. And when you're under these cost pressures, or you have limited dollars to invest, the increased volumes causes real problems. So usually the quickest response is to take these manual areas and put some bodies at it. Problem is the manual parts don't scale, and that's what's not being addressed. So we end up in an area where we're solving short-term issues, right, through adding capacity, but it's creating longer-term execution problems. So I think we're at a point in time where we can't just keep these old, outdated infrastructure, old operating models, these disparate systems. We really need to have and just basically having a plan that we're going to add people and hope that that's going to solve it, right? Because I like to say that hope is not a strategy. So everyone really needs to have a plan to look at their models, look at their data, look at their systems, and think about how you're going to change this, right? What's going to get you to where you need to be to solve your business needs later on down the road. I think whenever you make a change, you don't want to take these Band-Aid approach. You want to make an incremental and a thoughtful change to get to where you need to be.
Yeah, it's a really good perspective to think about. And with that in mind, there are a lot of kind of pressures influencing the industry at the moment, and influencing asset servicing. And Richard, you sit within I think on leading the corporate actions charge for the UK T1 task force. As the market moves to accelerate settlement, realistically, I think a lot of people don't think about it from a corporate actions perspective. But how do you see the impact for corporate actions income and voluntary event timelines?
Absolutely, and something you said there was very, very poignant of observations I made last week at T1 event. People are opening up to the fact that this isn't just a settlement issue, and that is obviously very welcome in the asset services community. But addressing corporate actions and income first, we're obviously going to see a convergence of ex-date and record date across the UK and Europe. There's going to be some challenges there, particularly in terms of securities lending. So you've got markets across Europe that differ in terms of entitlement for stock loan deals. some considering entitlement as being pre-ex date and some as having a settled record date position. So the challenge that creates is that if you sell short on T, the sell short's only going to be seen on T+1, and your stock loan desk is going to book their cover on a T0 basis. Now, as it stands, that may create a challenge for reverse market claims. This is a very current issue and one that ISLA, its members and the relevant task force are trying to solve. Whether will we see an increase in claims? Well, it's interesting that this was marginal when the US went T+1, but we are dealing with a very different beast. We're dealing with over 30 markets, I think over 90 different trading venues. So that's something I think the industry's got its eye on. Now, if you have read, and I hope anyone on this call has read, the UK and the EU task force's recommendations, automation features heavily. And as I said at an event last year, the winners here will be those that automate. The winners here will be those that also see this as a holistic challenge. They will partner with their trade support teams. They'll partner with their settlements teams to kind of build solutions that appreciate the fact that corporate actions is where problems arise. It's generally an upstream issue that corporate actions has to solve for. And I'll just spend some time on voluntaries here because I do think that people need to have a very careful think about how the landscape will look post-October 2027. So most large brokers at the moment do their work, and probably somewhere between 70 and 80% on the day prior to market deadline. And they can. And the reason they can is because they know their traded positions. So at that point in time, you've got a 12 to 15 hour window between your market deadline -1 and your agent deadline to solve any problems, to reconcile, and to get your instructions out there into the market. Under T+1, I mean, it depends on markets and whether we see more harmonization, but you're going to be lucky to have 5 hours. And that's going to cause a challenge. And firms need to really think about what the current process looks like. They may have to consider how they operate slightly differently in a possible T+1 environment. And I've said this before, and it sounds corny, and I don't care. But we really need to think. We always have to have a Formula One pit crew mentality to try and realize as many marginal gains as we possibly can. That gives us more time to make sure that the process is as risk controlled as possible.
Richard, yeah, that's okay. We like corny here, so you're fine with us. But Matt, thinking about it, I guess from a slightly different perspective, Richard gave a great analysis there of the specifics of how T1 is going to impact us on a day-to-day basis. But thinking about it more broadly, with T1 potentially acting as a catalyst for further asset servicing change, do you think that it could be that catalyst?
Yeah, absolutely. And firstly, I'll just commend Richard on commenting around the need for this to be viewed as an ecosystem, right? When I think about T+1, it is doing something very healthy for the industry, and that it's putting operational capabilities in the spotlight, right? And I think that is a very good thing for all of us. I think what we saw in the US, as Richard commented on, was that the transition, or the firms that transitioned the most smoothly, were those that had already invested in automation, had good data, they had good coordination through the life cycle of a trade. And I think those that had less of that in place found that manual processes just didn't scale under the time compression. One of the tailwinds that I think we have as we come into Europe is that I think the executive level, the board level focus on T+1 being such a widespread industry change, I think has really increased the understanding and the level of focus, again, on the operational side of it. So that is an opportunity. We should all make hay while the sun shines on that. For me, the second area of opportunity then comes in, and this is slightly different, I think, between the US and Europe, but we support many, many markets in Europe. they all have their nuances. They are slightly different. I think there is an outcome here where we could see harmonization as a result of T+1 and harmonization and T+1 being a catalyst for that. Whether that becomes a formal part of the regulatory framework, like that remains to be seen. Is it more of a guideline? Again, remains to be seen. But like for me, that's where the opportunity is. If we could exit T+1 with increased harmonization and with having redirected some of that executive level focus on operations into an improved processes, like that would be a great outcome for all of us.
And then Demi, over to you if I can. Just thinking about, I guess, that compressed settlement cycle, what data and communication bottlenecks do you think might become more visible when you think about it from the kind of issuer to investor flow?
Well, in the danger of being controversial here, when you think about investor communications, the thing that you're really focused on is position information, which is who holds a position, and being able to marry that with a communication back out. In terms of T+1, the communication aspect of the start of the chain, which is something's happening, I'm going to communicate that to the end investor. The settlement is really around updated position information. So from that perspective, nice big tick. You get cleaner data to sort of send information out to. But the problems that existed prior around where data comes from, the originating source, how you then collect it, scrub it, make sure from a compliance and risk perspective, you've ticked all your boxes and it's nice and clean to hand it, to create then a process of dissemination, whether it's ingestion in your own technology or passing it down to another intermediary in the chain. T+1 doesn't really, impact the ecosystem around investor communication cycle. Certainly helps with position information, but nothing's really changed in terms of how the process begins up front for the purposes of the distribution. Hopefully no one's going to throw anything at me, but from my perspective, an investor comms perspective, T+1 has lots of different advantages and create challenges, but from an investor comms perspective, nothing really has changed.
No, thank you, Demi. And then just thinking about it from the perspective of, I guess, data, and actually, Demi, I'll just stay with you for now, if that's okay. When I went through the slides earlier, I showed you that, 67% of errors stem from data issues. Where exactly, again, think about that issuer to investor lifecycle, where do you see the breaks occurring and what do you think is in most urgent need of change?
Well, I think the breaks always happen in the same places. Yeah. So your first break is the source of data, capturing the information and all the scrubbing that goes around creating, from your own personal perspective, that golden copy that you then set up on your system. I think there's a second break where it goes to another intermediary where there's enrichment of that announcement, whether it's coming from the issuer, whether it's coming from the CSD. There's typically a sub-custodian enrichment that takes place. So that's another element of touch point. And thirdly is then how the information goes up and down the chain. So you might have handoffs in the way in which information flows, typically now via SWIFT. 20022 is widely being adopted. A lot of effort has gone to create STP almost at an individual level, and then created downstream problems with zero tolerance by those accepting a SWIFT in, which caused, I think, a hump of learning for each of the intermediaries working on the SWIFT sort of exchange of communication sort of format. I think we're mostly over those. But then you've got the, whose right is it to obtain information, such as vote confirmation. Mm-hmm. So there's the passing down of the vote confirmation from the issuer back up to the investor, and that, how that process works is also a bit clunky. So things disappear or drop off that chain. So I think in summary, I think there's the originating source, there's the enrichment piece, and then there's the how that data goes up and down the chain, where the friction occurs around investor comms and data.
Yeah, the layer cake of I guess each intermediary in the chain adding information and interpreting potentially in different ways is a substantial challenge across the data side. And then, Larry, from your perspective, a number of brokers and investors cite that data sourcing and validation is their fastest growing cost. So how can firms stabilize their data flows even when issuers are inconsistent today, do you think?
Yeah, so look, I think a couple of us started off introducing ourselves as having 20 plus years in corporate actions and asset servicing, and we agreed not to drill into the plus. I also have 20 plus years, and since I started, we've been talking about how to kind of help issuers standardize. So I think it's fair to say that it's going to remain inconsistent for the foreseeable future. So I think what it means to us is that we have to change our mindset. We have to stop thinking of data as like a passive source or just an input and start taking control of it and adding an operational layer around that. And what I mean, right, ways to do that is first, right, there's really 3 steps I think about it. First is centralize it. So either create a center of excellence, scrubbing, some way to standardize your data flows, bring it all in, have a single service. So you're getting the right data up front, dealing with cleansed data up front, and you're not duplicating efforts. Second is you have to prioritize, right? When you're dealing with data, and especially when you standardize it and bring it in, it can become overwhelming. So you want to deal with the data that is a priority, right? So if we think about things like income events, they're high volume, but it's a small subset of information of data that's actually required to get that right. So you want to focus on those. When you think about stuff that involves tax or the more complex corporate actions events, there might be a broader set of data, but those are lower volumes. So when you prioritize, it really helps you to manage it. And then third, you want to introduce workflow and validation into that, right? So you can raise exceptions in real time, get it out ahead of everything, so you can really get the right eyeballs on it, bring the right technology and data points in to correct it, and then monitor that across the stream. So you're dealing with good data up front and good data that flows through all the way. So I think when we talk about stability, right, we're not going to issuers aren't going to change overnight. We already know that. So I think it's on us, right, on firms to take control of their own data quality, apply those consistencies, and really try to absorb that variability upstream, right, before it becomes an operational issue or concern downstream.
Thanks, Larry. And I guess with regards to firms taking, their own responsibility, Matt, if you were to receive, a clean, machine readable, standardized golden copy issuer data, what would that really do for your automation potential? Or would you still have internal controls that would limit kind of straight through processing?
I mean, look, absolutely, like, data is a bottleneck. Would a clean, crisp, accurate golden record increase automation? Like, yes, materially. Goes without saying. But I think similar to the points we just made, like, I don't think it is a hard blocker, right? So we have already automated significant portions, right, of the life cycle and of the different event types. And that's not just a GS phenomenon. That's something that I think we've all done across the industry. What I think that tells us is that our internal architecture still matters a huge amount, right? So if processes are brittle, doesn't matter if the data is cleaner, like, it's still going to end up with high levels of manual intervention, lower automation rate. So, like, for me, I think it's probably less around, is the issue golden copy? Is it not? I think really the issue is around, are we designing, like, the optimum operating models? Like, are we simplifying? Are we taking the opportunities to make sure that we have the best possible processes in place?
I'm going to stay with you, actually. We're going to have a little look forward now, if that's okay. Think about some of the optimistic views and kind of the business case for 2026. When we did our survey, it was workflow automation that came through as having the strongest ROI. So if compared to other new technologies, AI, etc., it was just workflow automation that came through as being the strongest. But then I guess on your side, at your firm, where are you focusing investment in 2026 to reduce that operational drag?
Yeah, and maybe just to really emphasize the point from the survey, like, workflow automation absolutely delivers strong ROI. When you look at a lot of the operational drag that comes through the processes, it's where you've got handovers, status changes, exception routing, right? So like workflow, I think for all of us is going to continue to be incredibly important. There's probably three other areas that are certainly gaining some conversation. So I think basic stuff like simplifying many of the platforms and processes and the way the industry operates is 20 years old, as are many of our experience in here. So I think taking a hard look at where is there simplification opportunities, where is some of that complexity necessary, and where is it self-inflicted? I think there's a ton of opportunity there, and we're going to continue to mine that. Second, can not mention AI. Like, I think we're going to continue to look at opportunities in terms of how you embed that within processes. I'm particularly bullish on places like asset servicing, where I think the ability to reason on some of the variation that we have, I think there is an incredible unlock there in terms of increasing the productivity of our people. And then thirdly, and I think this will be the same for everyone in operations, whatever function you're in, is that we're going to continue to tighten the guardrails around data. How do we make sure we've got the right governance structure? How do we make sure that is as good as it possibly can be?
Thanks, Matt. And then Richard, I guess from your side, Matt's covered AI, talked about simplification of processes, which seems like a great idea, more challenging to do with some of the workflows that I know we all have in our industry. But on top of those, any other kind of areas you think the industry should concentrate its efforts to get a strong ROI? I think in 26.
Yeah, absolutely. I think looking ahead, we've obviously got the headwinds of T+1. So I'm going to split into two categories. Firstly, I think our CSDs, exchanges, and trade associations, the relevant task force will need to concentrate on trying to get the standardization that we so desperately need within asset services when we're talking about the T1 in Europe and the UK challenge. There's a good opportunity here, I think, to create a standardization and correct some long-standing anomalies and inefficiencies. I think firms should be engaged and make their interpretations of the risks related to T+1, which is what I've already said, and they should lobby for any change where appropriate. But I think in terms of ROI, what we can control, what firms can control, that focus needs to be relative to their complexity and their resource. Going back to Larry's comments earlier, there are opportunities in the high volume, low complexity aspects of asset services, whether it be income or mandatory corporate actions. I think firms need to analyze and, importantly, scrutinize, potentially forensically, their processes. I go back to my pit crew mindset, which I mentioned earlier, but I do think it's a good one because then they can use this intelligence to re-engineer their process and look at implementing AI and automation to its fullest extent. And then that frees up resource to deal with much better, higher value tasks within the organization. The automation requirement will vary from firm to firm, but it should always be on where the volume is, low complexity and kind of manual tasks first.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And I guess, Larry, from your view, again, a look ahead to 2026. We talk about lots of technologies, APIs, managed data services. The guys have already referenced AI tools. What do you see as, kind of production ready for 2026 to really make a difference?
Yeah, look, as I look at 2026 and beyond, I think the reducing frictionless is the key. I was talking earlier about, I talked to a lot of people, they have multiple systems that aren't really well connected with processes in between. So that's really where things get held up, and that's what doesn't scale. So it's about reducing that friction. When we talk about technology available, right, the first one you mentioned is APIs. They're here now, right? Many people, I think most of us are familiar with using APIs in production now. So the key with that is you want to really use that, modern APIs on a modern technology stack. You want to make sure that your data is standardized, right? That you can do things in real time. You can really move that data around, and you leverage these APIs to connect these systems. So you no longer have all of these disparate systems, but you have one single system across asset servicing that allows you to connect it, right? Move data through in real time, raise exceptions, and really be smart about how you do it that way. Again, these are here, right? So use APIs to modernize your technology and your processes. Managed data was the second one you mentioned, managed data services. I think also those are here now, right? So that really helps us. And I think of it more broadly than just data. I think about managed service across all of it. So everybody should have a plan to modernize, and you can use managed services to help you in that modernization. They can help you to deploy where you have people now, where you have some of those manual processes in the interim, because it's great where they can move around and, right, they've really seen it all. So they work on economies of scale and can deploy people. But being there's a lot of knowledge there, they can also help, right, at least temporarily, as you move incrementally to that end model, that end state you want to be at. The third one you mentioned is AI, which, right, we love to talk about. That's here as well. I think that one is there's a little bit more caution around that, about how people deploy AI. So we're seeing it in works as far as exception handling, the ability to solve some of these data issues, right, with the unstructured data, being able to use language models to take stuff from, say, PDFs, and then around prioritizing tasks. So I think these work well in conjunction with people. So they can automate some, but they really work kind of like in a co-pilot manner, where they can help make people more efficient. So where you do have people involved, they're just able to take on more, and there's that place in check. So when it comes down to it, I think it's the lowest friction one that's really going to win. And to get there, you want to combine all of these. You want the APIs to connect and move the data around. You want AI involved to reduce manual intervention and help with some of these processes. And you could have a managed service to help with the data flow and ultimately help you get to where you need to go. Because I think the firms that have a plan to modernize and have an operation model that grows incrementally with their business is going to be the one that sees the best results.
Thanks, Larry. And then Demi, again, I can't really believe it's 44 minutes and no one's mentioned tokenization or distributed ledger technology, but what role do you see that playing in asset servicing?
Well, obviously tokenization, DLT has been around for a while. And when it first got introduced as a concept, and many of us looked at it in terms of experimentation and different pilots that we've done, there was initial a lot of optimistic thinking around how this could work. But really, tokenization and DLT it really works when the ecosystem adopts. Yeah, so doing it by yourself doesn't really give you much, but if you create an ecosystem and a platform for others to connect onto to solve a particular user case, you really start to get value out of it. So from a Broadridge perspective, we've had some great success with our fixed income bond DLT based product, which we've now got adoption on. But even our experience of it, building it and they will come, doesn't necessarily mean they'll come quickly. So I think there's certainly an opportunity to solve a lot of complexities in the asset servicing space, but without when you're a global investor or you're a global custodian or a global security servicing provider, you're dealing with multiple markets, with multiple regulations, with everyone needs to dance to the same tune, and making that happen overnight is extremely difficult. So I think my view on tokenization, specific user cases where there are core adopters that could then ignite wider adoption over a period of time, may give us some opportunity to do something really exciting. But it's going to be a slow burn, my prediction.
I think it's already been a slow burner. How long have we been talking about DLT and tokenization taking over at this point? It's been a while, and
I think the key difference now is there's a lot of regulators talking about it, and a lot of thinking being pushed through from the top down. Whether or not it's right or makes any sense, it's slightly questionable, but it's certainly highly topical, and a lot of firms are trying to figure out what it means to them.
Yeah, 100%. I can't believe it, but we're already at the top of the 45 minutes we had scheduled for today. I'd really just like to thank everyone for their time today. I'd like to remind you all that the key findings in the white paper are available at the link that we've posted in the chat box. Please go and have a look. There's some really interesting insights in there. The survey has responses from over 300 people. For the white paper, we interviewed a lot of interesting people in the industry, so we've got all of their perspectives in there. So please do take a look. And if you want to discuss any of them, feel free to give me a shout. I'd really like to thank our panelists today, and especially Broadridge for sponsoring the event and the campaign, Broadening Asset Services. So thank you to you all, and thank you to everyone for joining. Goodbye. Hope you have a great rest of your day.